Okay, everyone, it's Serotonin, back for one more video of the day. I really wanted to go back to this comment. A really mind-blowing statement here. Turns out the entire current state of Oregon was Russian America in 1841. I mean, wowzers. So, okay, I want to go through this with you because this document, it turns out, is just too much fun to go through on your own. And I really want to do this with you guys. So here we go. Hello, friends. Now it goes. Oddly enough, not about selling, donating, or renting Alaska. This information has recently appeared very rapidly in the media space and with a large number of spoilers. Exactly the opposite. Where is the truth here and where not? It is very difficult to understand. Everything comes from the words of historians, as a rule, without any documentary evidence. For this, perhaps let's take for a basis only documents that are in large quantities in foreign archives. Strangely enough, everyone knows about Russia America. Anyone knows, about Russia America, but not the Russians themselves. So let's fill in the gaps as much as possible. I would say nobody knows about Russian America, because I didn't, and I'm not everybody. I'm probably, relatively well educated. But hey, never heard of it, so I'm just not going to guess that everybody has, because I like to seek out information I don't know. I get a sense of things and I go for it. I don't get that from a lot of people these days, unfortunately. Anyway, here we have on this map, Amérique Russe, Russian America. Okay, so what do we know about the Russian America? Very little. The school taught that it is only overseas colony of Russian Empire and all other colonies were on its outskirts. We will not argue with teachers who are subject to communist ideology. It is interesting, but what is being taught now? Very true. But let us look at primary sources. So we're going to continue. Approximately such maps of the late 19th century are present in many sources. It can be seen that Russian America is concentrated in the southern part of modern Alaska. We will not go into details. Maybe to the north was just uninhabited, and I'm just going to go back up there and just show to you that indeed it just says here. And there's really not much business going on here, but they've got lots of cities going along here. Okay. The official history of Alaska is here. The motive of its transfer was the Crimean War showed complete insecurity of the eastern borders of the Russian Empire. The Crimean War is a separate story. In Western sources, it is called the World War. And I will write about it in some other time and what was actually before the Crimean War. How was Alaska reflected in official sources? Okay. No way, the Great White Spot, and California is an island. The map is quite official. There are two versions of comments about the White Spot. The first is difficult accessibility for ships. Not a clear version. The ships had already had all the technical capabilities to get the Bering Strait from the south. It does not matter from which side they came there, from the east or west, the west or east. The colonies of all European powers at the time were all along the Pacific coast, including the Asian coast. It does not sound very convincing. The second version is of more conspiracy category, the Great Tartary. Still existing at that time, did not allow other ships into its maritime domains. But technically this is possible only now. Radar equipment for detecting ships appeared relatively recently. Well, I'd argue that, actually. So how could she not let? It is another thing if foreign sailors knew what awaited them in Tartaria and they were simply afraid to go there. More like the truth, but still the daredevils were at all times and in all countries. Also not convincing. So what was really there? Let's raise old cards. So I really like this. So they're saying that basically there's rumor that Tartarians were vicious and awful, just like today with Russia, the Cold War and, in modern politics, this whole Russian collusion thing that's just going on, and it's so ridiculous given the crimes that are obvious and all of the, stuff that's going on with the particular political party that is being upset by these Russian collusion things. It's hilarious. It's the old monster again. It's just so ridiculous. So let's get through to the next. Okay. So this map is from the foreign edition of the Exploration du territoire de l'Oregon, de Californie et de la mer Vermeille, exécutée pendant les années 1840 et 1841. Studies conducted in 1840. Most likely, it is the only field part of the research. It can be seen that there are at least 3 territorial entities in the territory of Alaska, and there are also cities with distorted Slavic toponymy. Previously, this happened when words in Cyrillic writing were left and copied to Latin characters without translation. The cities of Ragul, Solboy, and Sibiryak turn out all along one river, and Alaska was called Anyan. Now, the toponymy here There is no such name. I just wanted to point this out. This is really important to me. So here, I've looked at this before, this Chalaga map. I never saw this before, Hochelaga. But let's have a quick look at a current map of Chicago. And we're just going to zoom out here. Okay, do you see where Chicago is on the map? Do you see where Chalaga is on the map? Chicago is literally, it's lakeside, like it's like on the lake, like Toronto, right on the lake. So where do you think Hochelaga is these days? Okay, now there's a reason why when I first went on this page, I had the water crib showing. Got me thinking some of these old water cribs, they might have just been large structures that, for whatever reason, never made it under the water when they flooded Hochelaga. Because we have seen now more than one map where there are no Great Lakes, many rivers, opportunities for flooding, but no Great Lakes. And we know that they have flooded. I did find this interesting in a recent video that I saw. I did know about this, and I actually really forgot about it. But along the St. Lawrence River, 10 towns were flooded. 10 towns, sorry, not cities. Sorry, people. Oh, this is so silly. Why can't I? History of flooding in Canada. Okay, so that's another one, right? Underwater ghost cities and buildings. Okay, this really only shows like a little bit of it because it shows a lot of ones from Argentina and whatnot. But yeah, there we go, the lost villages of Ontario, Canada. That's the St. Lawrence River, and every single one of these was a village. And they flooded the whole lot of them. All of them. Because they were making the St. Lawrence River, apparently. So I don't believe that for a second. Anyway. Moving on. This is a continuation of the same map to the east. The south shore of the Hudson Bay. Continuing on. This is a card. I think they mean map. Carte. Oh, it's from French. Okay, carte is map in French. Card. This is a carte, a map with an uncertain year. All North America, for some reason, is called Mexican. There are all those lands that were listed on previous maps. On the west coast, there is already an English colony called New Albion, which, according to official data, was formed in 1555 and flourished mainly due to trade with Japan. With Japan? Question mark. Which has never had minerals, forests, and other resources of interest to the British. As you can see, New Albion was an autonomous entity who had no communication with the colonies of England on the Atlantic coast. A small detail. Hardly. A thriving colony of England does not have on the maps the complete outline of the western shores of North America, as mentioned above, until the second half of the 19th century. Seems to be absurd, but as it turns out, these cards are still there. These maps are still there. Okay, I will need time to understand this because there's all sorts of colorful business going on here, and that's just what? So I need some time to look at that. Anyway, we'll keep going with this for now. Whoops, how many interesting things. First of all, the outlines of the shore of North America are not at all the same as they are now. And on the map, 1757, at the site of the Aleutian Islands is land. There is the Gulf of Alaska, and the mainland itself is crossed by large lakes and straits. The color indicates the water basins of the river for each ocean. Okay, I was wondering about that. And it would be okay. This card, this map, is one, but there are several of them, and they clearly show that North America has 3 islands in the northwestern part, separated by wide straits, and even they have a name. And I will say northern Canada is largely, you know, we just kind of don't go there. I must say, I think I've just realized that all of the text, is text for the image above. So I will do my best to kind of help it a little bit better with that. Okay. Giving on. Oh, here we have more maps. Okay, Tartarian Ocean, the land the Jesuits traveled over to the latitude of 66. That's interesting. Lake Velasco. Parmenians, Conafit, Archipelago of St. Lazarus, the Straits of Anian, the Western Ocean. All of this is very strange if we take into account that such geographical features simply disappeared in the period 1760 and 1840. Almost nowhere on the top map, the cartographer imposes Hudson's Bay of uncertainty. Obviously, the area before him from these 3 islands is not explored. What is there now? Well, that's what they say there is. There's not even a hint of the fact that Alaska Bay was, well, as once there were 3 islands, but if you look closely, it is clear that lowland marshy areas in places of the former straits. What could it be like that? Obviously, as elsewhere, huge mudslide passed. Mud flood. Jesus, full of amazing stuff. Very large amount of land was washed away from the north and covered all of the northwestern lands. Accordingly, only bare rocks remained in the northern territories. The same picture is actually from Scandinavia to Chukotka. The water of the great waves, of the giant waves going back, went through the Bering Strait and washed away all the land in the Aleutian Islands. I don't know about that either, and the largely densely populated country has gone down in history. I don't believe that. I think it was bombed away. And who lived there? If in 1741 it was the Russian lands, then surely it was, as it is now. The main Russian nation lives in relative harmony with the Bashkirs, Caucasians, Buryats, and other small nations on one common territory. It is a historical national tradition not to violate the culture of small nations and not to conduct violent Russifications, unlike, for example, England. That is most likely it was there, and the bulk of the Slavic population lived together with other ethnic groups, historically found in these places. Other ethnic groups were of Mongoloid origin. It is not surprising. If the climate in those places before the disaster was habitable, which is likely, these territories were a continuation of the huge Asia, despite the fact that formerly it was already another continent. Incredible. If the cartographers were not mistaken, then the Bering Strait was not a big hindrance for migration at that time. In one edition, I found a portrait of the indigenous inhabitants of the northwestern lands of North America in those times through the eyes of the Europeans. Very white. They look very interesting. Not what you'd expect. Not what you'd expect given the education they tried to give us. It was once in the Crimea, in the Bakhisarai. There are almost all of them. It does not look like the portrait of those Indians about whom a lot of books have been written. No wonder it is a portrait type of a typical resident of Tartaria. Their descendants now live through Russia. It has been scientifically proven that 4 main nations, Kalmyks, Bashkirs, Buryats, and Tuvans, are of Mongoloid race on the territory of Russia. Small peoples living in northern or eastern territories are descended from the first 3, not counting the admixture of the people who historically lived in other territories, Chinese or Koreans. All the other indigenous inhabitants of those places are Slavs, due to historical reasons that have adopted culture of other nations. This has already been scientifically proven by geneticists. It turns out that in Tartaria and Russian America, there live the same ethnic groups as in the European part, well, maybe with a slightly different culture. They live from time immemorial, and not after the discovery of them by Bering. But suppose the north part of Russia, America, was destroyed by catastrophe. So what happened to the more southern American lands is an even more interesting map. Okay, again, I need time to look at this map. It's so crazy big. It turns out that the entire current state of Oregon was Russian America in 1841, and it was officially called that. I do not pretend to authorship of this discovery. This has already been claimed for a long time, but I saw the cartographic material for the first time, and it turns out that the English territory of New Albion is nothing but a territory pressed or bought out from the then inhabitants of those territories of Slavic region. And this territory developed only thanks to trade with local population. You can still talk about Fort Ross or Hawaii, but this was most likely a small part of the general history of Russian America. From the beginning of the 19th century, something has already been described in many alternative sources has happened. After the man-made disaster that destroyed Tartaria and Russian America in the northern part, these lands were emptied. That is why, from that time on the maps in that place, there was a white spot, because nobody knew what the ground became there. A reasonable question, very interesting theory, a reasonable question arose about the further ownership of these lands, and the strong applicants of that time began to fight for it. And the French, the Canadian French, for Quebec, their phrase is "Je me souviens," I remember. And they won't forget. They won't forget. It's very interesting. They're a very interesting group of French people. The activity of the historical character Vitus Bering is very doubtful. If he really carried out this voyage in the years that the official story ascribes to him, 1728 to 1733, then the conclusion suggests itself that he was sent by the Romanov court, or how they are there, to explore what remains of those lands in general. At the time, they knew very well what kind of land there was before the man-made disaster, but most likely, knowing the tendency of domestic historians to shift the chronological scale, his voyage was about 100 years later. The house of the Romanovs almost legally began to lay claim to these lands as a successor, but besides him there were still many willing from the leading countries of Europe. Further, as many sources tell, the Russian Empire decided to finish Tartaria from the west, starting with Muscovy. They're still finishing it. They haven't. And yet it stood, right? Because everything's changing now. So, starting with Muscovy and joining forces with Europe, organized the invasion of Napoleon to Moscow. 2 years there is a war, ending with the expulsion of the enemy to Paris. This event has been described in many sources, but nevertheless it is still one of the biggest white spots in Russian history. But few people know at the same time the then United States begins a war of independence with England attacking Canada. And this war also ends at the same time. The war is also a big blank spot on history, the War of 1812, which we know there's like the earthquakes, there's the comets, there's all kinds of stuff going on there. And it's very interesting because Americans don't maybe talk about 1812 as much, but Canadians, like, we burned down their White House, or so the story goes. So there's a lot of pride, anti-American Canadian pride comes from that. This war is also a big blank spot in history. Who are the Americans attacking? Military operations were conducted in the Great Lakes region, and the Indian uprising is mentioned, which was suppressed. What kind of Indians? Maybe there were those who now live in Mexico, but most likely there was a seizure of the first lands inhabited by the Russian population, Oregon and western lands remaining independent. And skirmishes between the United States and England continued there until 1846, when this state officially entered the United States. Well, actually, now we will look at the map. Comments are probably superfluous. The Russian Empire begins to develop Alaska virtually anew, building ports at the confluence of large rivers into the oceans and seas. But the Crimean War begins. One of the fronts of this is Kamchatka. Obviously, the combined troops decided to strike at the military forces of the Russian Empire in that region, so they could easily occupy all territories, including Alaska, but suffered a defeat. To put it mildly, this fact in national history is little known, but apparently, having suffered a defeat in the war, diplomacy went to work. It was difficult to establish what was really there, but they came to what they came to. There is evidence that up to 1920 there were practically no Americans in Alaska, and she still had lived her life in direct connection with the mainland. Well, actually, the conclusion is that today's sluggish encroachments in the Donbass, figuratively speaking, are not all the scale events that in America had just over 100 years ago. There's another huge distortion of the story. Okay, that was so amazing. That was really amazing. What do you think, guys? Questions? Comments? Please share this. Have a great night. God bless.